All right. We are streaming in a second. It still says setting up, but probably any second now. This is going to be going to our YouTube channel as well. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we are streaming in a second. It still says setting up, but probably any second now. This is going to be going to our YouTube.
Back the loop. So Josh, let me open it up. Welcome everybody to our 2022 virtual conference on emotional intelligence in higher education. We are excited to be with you all today and share this time and space. My name is Isaac Carter. I am a preferred partner with 6 Seconds and founder of Coaching the Imperative. And I'm really happy for us to have this time for us today in this important event that we're having to hopefully feel how we can advance the practice and theory of emotional intelligence in higher education. And part of the reason is just we know EQ is important for leadership and et cetera, but we also understand that we are living in a world in some changing times. We have events here in the United States and globally that require us to be able to work better together, to be able to work collaboratively and think through situations. And when we find divisiveness, trying to find a way to be able to find some consensus and move things forward. And so a conference is going to take place over these 3 days. Today, we're starting out talking about students and their well-being. And we have a wonderful panel of students that are going to introduce themselves in a minute. Before we have the students and as well as our professionals on the line with us this panel, I'm gonna ask that Amal introduce herself and tell her where you are talking from. I'm coming to you all from Miami, Florida.
Thank you, Isaac. I'm Amal Al-Khlewi. I work in higher ed. I'm an assistant professor, and I also have different admin roles. I am from Saudi Arabia, and I'm really excited to be here with you today because I know that emotional intelligence is really important for higher education. And I want to learn from your experiences to understand how we can successfully incorporate this into higher education. And I'm so excited to learn about you.
Yeah, so let's start out with the student. Our panelists can introduce themselves, tell us where you are logging in from, and tell us a little bit why you agreed to be on this panel today.
I guess I can start. So my name is Noah Caesar Kim. I use he, him pronouns. Currently, I'm calling from San Francisco, and I'm a rising undergraduate senior at Tufts University. And part of the reason that I'm kind of here today, firstly, because I've become a lot more familiar with emotional intelligence and social emotional learning, especially this past year. And I've come to understand that in a more profound way because of all the different hats that I wear on my college campus. I'm a residential advisor, so I'm constantly working with freshmen, especially freshman residents, and kind of coaching them, mentoring through that process of adjusting to school. And obviously this was kind of this past year has been our first year back, where the freshmen have had somewhat of a more regular adjustment to college, but the effects of the pandemic can still really be seen in the way that they've adapted and the way that they've transitioned into the college environment. I'm also a P3 pedagogical partner, which I know is a mouthful, on campus, which means that I partner up with faculty members and kind of take a look at courses and try and give feedback from a student perspective in terms of how we can adjust and how we can make changes and how we can incorporate things like emotional intelligence into their courses. And so kind of from the variety of perspectives, I come here and, also I want to speak from my perspective as a student and be able to elevate my voice.
Thank you very much, Noah. How about we go to Deborah? That's my screen to the right for me.
Yeah, sounds good. Hello, guys. Good morning or good afternoon or whatever it is for you. My name is Deborah. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a rising senior as well at Tufts University. I'm currently joining in from New Jersey. I'm visiting a friend, but I'm originally from Brockton, Massachusetts. And my reason for being here is that I feel like this past year has been a lot of reflection for me on my own educational journey, a lot of understanding why I did certain things and why certain teachers did certain things, and kind of realizing that the missing piece was this more emotional aspect. And I think my own desire to kind of disconnect the emotions from the learning. And I realized that's not it. That's not what I want to do. Especially since I do a lot of work with youth advocacy. I currently work for Big Brothers Big Sisters on the recruitment team, where I recruit both the youth and the mentors. I also help run a mentorship program at Tufts, and it's kind of all inspired by this own desire of being the mentor to someone that I didn't have growing up. So that's why I'm here today. I'm excited to learn from all of you as well, though, of course. I'm here to learn. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deborah. Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel. I use she, her pronouns. I just graduated from Tufts in May, so no longer a Tufts student, but still so close to it. I'm calling in from Buenos Aires, Argentina. So my Wi-Fi isn't great. It's been freezing a few times, like everyone's frozen, and I was like, oh my God, what's happening? So I apologize in advance if like I cut out or something like that, but hope right now it seems okay. I'm here today because I'm super passionate about emotions and their role in education. My senior year, I wrote a thesis on basically like knowledge systems and how in the United States, our knowledge systems that influence education are very much situated in white supremacy and really rely on this divide between emotion and what we consider to be objective knowledge. And we really don't leverage emotion as something that really teaches us a lot about ourselves and the world around us, and just how our embodied reactions to whatever is happening can teach us so much about everything. So I'm really interested in just really leveraging how emotion is just such a great teacher for everything, and also just how different emotions play out in the classroom depending on someone's positionality. So that's something I'm super interested in. I have experience teaching with Breakthrough for the past 2 summers, and also during the school year, I got to teach in person in Cambridge these past 2 semesters, working with middle schoolers, which has definitely taught me a lot of how important it is to have emotional intelligence in the classroom, because they have a lot going on. And I think really holding space for emotion in that type of teaching environment allows for the connections that are necessary to teach middle schoolers to actually form. So that's really taught me how important it is to hold space for emotion in the classroom. And yeah, I'm really excited to hear from everyone and just have a conversation about something that I think is super important.
Wow. Thank you, Rachel. Thank all the students for the introduction. Now I want to invite my colleagues, panelists on here to introduce themselves before we start jumping into some of the questions. Rochonda, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Isaac. I appreciate that. Hello, everyone. My name is Rochonda Nenonene. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Teacher Education at the University of Dayton. And so I'm happy to be here. I write and do a lot of instruction in terms of social emotional learning. I'm also a program director of a program we have, a co-director called the Urban Teacher Academy. And that's really, SEL has been a growing part of what we have been integrating into our program for our teacher candidates. And actually, Noah, I have some resonance with you. I also am coordinator of the first year experience. And so I very much know well incoming first year students come in with a lot of skill sets and needs, and particularly our students on campus increasingly have been coming something like 33% over the last 3 years, increasing number of anxiety and depression. And how do we help students on campus transition to college, but help them emotionally to be secure so that we retain them, that they're able to achieve the goals that they have while they're at the university, which is really important for us. So how do we sustain that in a a significant way that helps people's emotional well-being as they go out. And particularly as we train teacher candidates to go into classrooms to engage and implement SEL with confidence and fidelity is really important to us. It is mandated by the state of Ohio that all school districts have an SEL program and implement that P12. And so it's very much a part of our program. So I'm happy to be here. And I just have to say, I love what people are putting in the chat, particularly Emily Graham. Shout out to you. She said SEL is her jam. I need that as a bumper sticker or a t-shirt or something. So glad to be here with you all.
Thank you, Rochonda. Well, we have one more introduction, Robert.
Thank you, Isaac. My name is Robert Emmerling. I'm the director and co-chair of the Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence in Organizations, which is based at Rutgers University. I'm just got a new assignment to start teaching in the doctoral program in organizational psychology there, which I'm super excited about, since it's the actual program that I graduated from. I won't say how long ago, but it was quite a while ago. And when I'm not there, you'll find me here. I'm actually a visiting professor in the Department of People Management and Organization at Issac Business School here in Barcelona, Spain, where I'm coming to you from now. My interest in emotional intelligence has spanned, basically the last 25 years, doing research on, how emotion and emotional intelligence impact leadership, impact work performance, and emotional well-being. I work mostly with MBA students, and I work a lot in executive education related to leadership development. So that's a bit my background. I've also had the good fortune to, although I was born and raised in California, I spent most of my professional life outside the United States, working here in Europe. I also spend a lot of time, before the COVID pandemic hit, I spent a lot of time in India and Malaysia, actually working in the banking and energy sectors there. So that's a little bit about my background.
Thank you very much, Robert. I'm hoping that everybody that's viewing, you see that we have a very talented, knowledgeable, and experienced panel. And I'm so looking forward to us jumping into getting their thoughts on some of these questions we're going to pose. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Amal, who's going to start us out with our first question for the panel.
Yeah, I'd love to know how everyone was introduced to EQ. How were you first introduced to EQ? What grabbed you? And I guess we can start with Noah, maybe. Go back, do the round again.
Yeah, so my first exposure to EQ was actually very late on, and it was in my freshman year of college, taking an intro to psychology course. That was my first hearing of EQ, but I wouldn't say that it fully gripped me at that time. I guess kind of like my aha moment, the moment where I really began to see the incredible utility of EQ and of social emotional learning, was taking Deborah Donahue-Keegan's course this past semester at Tufts University. I know that she's in the chat, so shout out to her. But yeah, and I think that what resonated with me about that is it put into words a lot of what I had struggled with during the pandemic, and a lot of what my peers had struggled with during the pandemic, which was, just kind of a failure to take care of ourselves and trying to understand how to cope with the feelings of isolation that a lot of us felt, kind of a lack of purpose, a lack of drive. And I think that social emotional learning, which is kind of how I was introduced to this subject, really put into words a lot of what I'd been feeling, and a lot of what my residents and a lot of the peers that I interacted with on campus had been feeling. So that was kind of how it really resonated with me. And then since then, it's kind of taken a hold in my teaching pursuits as well, in my work with Breakthrough and my work with younger students. So I'm kind of seeing it on all levels, and obviously we'll talk a lot specifically about in colleges and universities, but as people have made abundantly clear by now, there's pressing need for it in that sphere of education, for sure.
Thank you. Deborah.
Yeah, so fun fact, Noah and I were actually in the same class. Yes, it was an amazing class, and that definitely transformed and solidified a lot of what SEL meant and how important it was. But I think for me, my first reckoning moment was probably the end of high school. I don't know about you guys, but my favorite letter was A. My favorite number was 100. I was the student, and if I wasn't, there was something wrong. And so my validation came strictly from those grades. And for the first time in my last year of school, I got a B. I cried so hard. I was like, what's wrong with me? I'm not smart. What is happening? And I spent the whole night thinking about, why was it that my validation came from grades? Why was it that I put value on something that didn't actually define who I was? I was not what I produced. And I realized that to me, my validation was my control, right? This letter grade, it was something that I could excel in. It was something that I could be the best in. It was a moment of realizing that at home, I couldn't control certain situations, struggling with poverty and food insecurity and home insecurity. School was all that I could control, so I made it a point to excel in it. And it was that night that I realized that school and emotions don't have to be separate, that if anything, it's hindering me if I don't acknowledge how I'm feeling in my emotional well-being in this whole process, because I was learning, and I learned more in that class than I had ever before in any other class. So that was my moment of oh, maybe I should, think about myself as well and how I'm learning, and not just this grade and being the very best. And I've excelled since then. And I've made it a point in college to practice it on myself, being more compassionate with myself. And after taking an SEL class this past year, I realized how important it can be for my own community as well. And I've been aiming to incorporate it with the kids that I work with. Yeah.
Thank you. Rachel.
Hi, my Wi-Fi is dropping in and out, so hopefully it stays stable while I'm talking. Yeah, I feel like I didn't really have a big moment where I was oh, this is emotional intelligence. And I think a big part of that is I don't think I was ever given a solid definition of what emotional intelligence is. And I think my own personal definition of what emotional intelligence is has changed as I've taken more classes, especially in college, and classes like Deborah's class, which I took freshman year, which was a really big turning point for me, like everyone has already said. Because I think in high school, I knew what emotional intelligence was, as if someone said it, I wouldn't be oh, what's that? But I didn't really know what it was. It didn't have any meaning for me. And very similar to Deborah, grades, I very much let define me, because I had with mental health, and I was okay, if I can do well in this, then everything else, whatever, it's fine. So I think I really put a lot of pressure on myself there, and I think I kind of lost myself in it. But I took a class in college that was called, I think it was called decolonization, and we read this book that it's called As We Have Always Done. I think something about indigenous resurgence through knowledge systems. I don't remember the exact title, but it's by an author called what's her name? Betta Samosaki Simpson, I think. I can put it in the chat, I can look it up. But there was this quote that talks about how we engage in the world is the transformation. So how molds and then gives birth to the present, and the how is what changes us. And I think that really changed my understanding of emotional intelligence, of thinking of, okay, how I'm engaging with myself and other people in the classroom, outside the classroom, is really what is shaping my future, what is shaping my present, and what's going on for everyone. So I really started thinking about, I need to be more in tune with myself and the way I'm treating myself and the way I'm treating others, because if I have this vision of what collective liberation looks like but I'm beating myself up about grades, which are just another form of hierarchy in the classroom, or I'm thinking a certain way about myself or other people, then I'm not making that a reality. So for me at this point in time, that emotional intelligence is really, are my actions and my thoughts in line with the future I want to live in? And I think that has really allowed me to re-ground myself in what I think of as emotional intelligence, and really think of, okay, like, I'm not going to beat myself up over this if the world I envision as what is the future I want, like, we don't, like, grades are not going to exist in the same way. So why am I spending all my time, you know, getting myself down about this? And just the way I treat others, I think, is also the same way. Like, we need to start now treating each other in this kind of emotionally intelligent way if that's what we want for the future. So I think it's very much been something that's been present my whole life, but changing as I learn and grow.
Thank you. I am so impressed with how you all are, the various ways you have applied emotional intelligence to your lives and the significance it plays as you move forward, as you go from education, working with youth, or starting to interrogate our systems of oppression in our society and our world globally. Emotional intelligence is a very key skill to help us do that well and go beyond the challenges. Before we go to the next question, I'm actually interested if Rochonda and Robert would kind of tell their first experiences with the emotional intelligence. What was the encounter, your aha moment?
I agree with you and Isaac, what you said about what the students have shared. And I think that it's good that it's coming through. I always think, like, do things translate? Are we talking about this? I'd love to see that. I was thinking about that. And I think in some ways, when I was, I remember teaching, and in P-12 setting, I taught middle school. And I think my first, not formal way of understanding emotional intelligence was actually trying to figure out how to meet the needs of students and families who I was serving, and realizing that capacity to make good decisions and to have the support you need, really, it was kind of in a practical way, right? But my formal understanding of it probably started more in graduate school, when we began to look at, talking about Maslow, and then thinking about how you meet the needs of kind of a very basic level. But more so, and I think there's a thread of Deborah Donahue Keegan here. So, like, she is the powerhouse woman here, because I did some intensive series of year studies, and actually started in the first cohort with Deborah, and we went to California to sessions that was put on by Nancy Markowitz and the Center for Reaching and Teaching the Whole Person, affiliated with San Jose State. And we began to talk about, how do you look at social emotional learning from the perspective of working particularly with teachers as they understand it for themselves, and then also how they help it with students. And so going to it that way has been much more kind of deliberate in terms of what do we do in terms of practice and pedagogy, and how do we weave this into curriculum. Now, having said that, I think EQ is something that has evolved over time. When we all were talking, it made me think about Bell Hooks when she wrote Teaching to Transgress. Like, part of what she talks about is, like, how do you meet the needs of yourself and others, and build these protective spaces so people can be who they are and understand their heritage and traditions and become fully the person they want to become. So I think it's very much a part of the conversations that we've been having. You can see it in Bettina Love's work right now in terms of abolitionist teaching, in terms of how you create safe spaces for students and you help them gain the confidence that they need. So I think many scholars have been talking about this and kind of actualizing this in many ways. So it's good to see all the intersectionality of it.
Thank you.
Well, I can say a little bit about, I guess, how I first got in to the field. I'm going to date myself a little bit here, because in 1997, when I was a doctoral student, the Emotional Intelligence Consortium at Rutgers had actually just been founded the year before. And I had the very good fortune to become a research assistant in this new, exciting research consortium, dedicated to understanding what we know, what the cutting edge research said about emotions and emotional intelligence in the workplace. Hugely exciting. I had the very good fortune to meet a lot of the founders in the field. I got to work a lot with Dr. Goldman, help him with the book Working with Emotional Intelligence. I hadn't really necessarily started out my doctoral training thinking that I was going to be dedicating my life to emotional intelligence. But the more and more I learned about how powerful this theory and the tools and the methods that go along with it can be to do things like improve subjective well-being and fairness in the workplace. I've always been attracted to the idea of helping leaders, and by leaders, I mean also the next generation of leaders, students, MBAs, executives, whoever they are, become more emotionally intelligent leaders. As we know, the link between employees' mental health and the social emotional intelligence of the leader, especially their direct supervisor, are highly linked. I mean, this is really a very, in my mind, very important lever that we can pull in applied practice by teaching leaders how important it is. As I always tell leaders, people don't quit leaders who are high on social emotional intelligence. Okay, if someone answers the question, my leader believes in me and is dedicated to my learning and growth, very unlikely that anybody's going to quit that leader. It's one of the most powerful tools, for lack of a better term, that leaders have. And it's grounded in social emotional intelligence. Being a good leader, in my mind, I mean, is grounded in an understanding of people's emotions and your own, right? Leader self-awareness is key before that leader can go any further. Okay. So these are some of the ways that I kind of got excited and still remain, after 25 years, even more excited about the potential for emotional intelligence going forward, maybe than I was even when I started.
Thank you, Rochonda and Robert. It is unique to hear you all both perspectives from the students and the professional, that they have so many shared points of interest and have different convergences. Put it in the chat, a quote from Bell Hooks. Rochonda talked about Bell Hooks as one of my favorite scholars and people in life. God rest her soul. So as someone who aspires to be a Black male feminist, she was definitely one of those people who was my guide. And emotional intelligence has been integral to that journey, because having to deal with the emotions of what it means for your power and privilege to be in a place and be able to help people understand and move things forward is a unique challenge. And being able to navigate the emotions around that is definitely essential. Amal, we want to go to the next question to the panel?
Sure. Which aspect of your life has changed the most through EQ? And I don't know, we can start with Rachel this time.
Yeah, so I think a big difference between my life in high school and college is high school, I feel like everything was very regimented. Like I had my social life, then I had school and everything, family and everything's very separate. And I think in college, it's all very integrated. So I think it would be very difficult to choose a specific part of my life that has been most impacted by emotional intelligence. I know in my classes, we've read a lot of bell hooks, and I feel like, I don't know if it was for class or on my own, but I read All About Love, and like that was like the game changer for me. I think my social circles are so influenced by all of this work of really being intentional about love and spaces for healing, because I don't know if this is a common experience for all people on college campuses, but I think definitely from people coming from marginalized communities that it's a lot of focus on healing in friend groups. It's a lot of moving through trauma and learning what it means to be away from home, what it means to be yourself, what it means to balance all these different pressures. So I think the emotional intelligence I was cultivating in the classroom, because I'm an was an American Studies major and education major. So it was all my education was very much rooted in these ideas of collective liberation and what does this future look like. And that translated seamlessly into my social life of thinking about, what does it mean to take up space in this PWI, and how do we do that and take care of ourselves and stay true to ourselves at the same time. So I think it's hard to choose like just one place, but I think I felt it the most probably in my social circles of, that deep self-reflection, and how do we not project insecurities or trauma on others, and how do we take accountability for the places where we've been harmed that causes us to cause harm, but like how do we take accountability and do better and break these cycles, and just this deep self-awareness and having these conversations of vulnerability, which I've had in the classroom and out of the classroom, which I think is really cool. And I've developed a lot of deep friendships with people from my classes, which I really appreciate. And just having these relationships that center around healing and joy, like require this emotional intelligence. And something I talked a lot about in my thesis, it actually comes from Bettina Love. I read We Want to Do More Than Survive, is this idea of like a home place. And what does that mean in education? Just a space where we can all show up really authentically, and also is a space that's very intentional about breaking down systems of oppression, namely like white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, all of that. So I think my social circles have been more than just friend groups, but spaces where we are healing together and really doing the work to prioritize emotional intelligence and humanity over academia, and like what that looks like, and what it means to come out of college feeling whole, because that's really hard. So yeah, I think that is all just blended together I think I'm really lucky to have been able to take classes that were focused on that and not take classes that were really STEM based. Not that STEM can't do this, but it doesn't come as naturally. So yeah, I think I've been really lucky that it's just kind of been a defining factor of my whole experience in higher education. It's been a struggle because it feels like the rest of higher education is the exact opposite, and then you're just kind of moving through this tunnel and trying to like protect yourself from everything coming in from the outside. But yeah, I've been really lucky that it's been my priority throughout my whole experience.
Thank you, Rachel. The power of reflection that you're adding, I think it's really important. Deborah?
Yeah, very similar, I think, to Rachel, in a similar vein. For more background, I am the first person in my family to go to college. I'm the first generation American as well in my family. And I come from a community that not everyone went to college. I never really had anyone to kind of look up to and for guidance. I went through the college application by myself. And this is the story of a lot of people. Like, I don't want to come here and sit here and say like, it's just me. Like, the reality is a lot of people do go through this, and it's kind of unspoken and it does a lot of disservice. But anyways, moving on. Yeah, I felt a lot of feelings of inadequacy and burnout, and just feeling like I didn't deserve to be there because I didn't have any models in my life or any outpour in my life that was like, no, like, you deserve to be here and you will excel here. And it's not that my parents didn't want to. It's not that people around me didn't want to see me succeed. It's just they didn't have the energy or time or knowledge to do so. And I think mentorship in particular has been so transformative for me. It's a very, I think it's a specific topic in emotional intelligence, but really important. I realized that like what I really strived for, what I really wanted was a mentor. And while I thankfully have had many big adults in my life that I have been able to look up to. In my college experience, I didn't have it when I was younger. And so I aimed to do that for someone else. Like, that became my journey, is to be a mentor for someone else, and not just go out there and yes, like, I'm going to be your mentor, but just act in a way that I know if someone was looking at me, like, they'd be like, wow, like, there's something different about her. Like, maybe I should strive to be like learn from her in some ways. I had to learn how to show myself a lot of grace and give myself a lot of compassion and understand that the transformation that's happening, like, it's going to be very painful, but like there's so much joy to come still. So I started implementing practices like radical rest and like intentionally looking at my education as more like a journey, and investing my energy in giving as much back as I can to kids who grew up in similar situations to me, because work and justice and equity like cannot be done without this basis of socio emotional learning. So yeah.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
Noah.
Yeah, thank you both of you for sharing. When I think about this question, the more and more I look at it, the more and more I kind of mull it over. I think I also have a little bit of trouble answering it for the same reason that Rachel kind of began to articulate, which is that one of the biggest impacts that emotional intelligence and this understanding of wellness is something that's truly holistic has had on my life is the fact that I've allowed my emotions and my familiarity with my emotions and just the constant process of checking in with myself, that I've allowed that to enter spaces where previously, that kind of self-reflection wasn't welcome. And I think that and obviously we'll talk a bit about, how colleges and universities can meet students halfway. But I also experienced a great deal of confusion when I first entered onto the college campus and into this space, that there was kind of this unwritten code, this unwritten culture of academia that I didn't really feel connected to. I didn't feel tethered to that. And I think I also came onto my college campus, really seeking a mentor, really seeking someone that would guide me through that process. And so obviously I have a lot of friends to thank for that. And I also have folks like my freshman year RA to thank for that. But I found that was really hard to come across on the college campus. And I see that for a lot of my freshmen as a residential advisor too. So I guess what I'm trying to articulate is that firstly, I've come to see wellness as something very holistic, as something that I bring with me into the classroom rather than exclude. And I think because of that, a lot of what Deborah and Rachel have said in terms of cherishing the process a little bit more of learning and being a little bit less results focused, like I know a lot of students are. That has definitely been a kind of a huge impact on my education and my journey, and finding out what really drives me and what really motivates me, which up to this point has been working with other students, both college students and then as of right now, 8th graders. And so just really embracing emotional wellness and my understanding of my emotions in all spheres of life. And I think that kind of as others have hinted at, is inextricably tied to my sense of purpose and discovery, and really figuring out what drives me and what motivates me, as opposed to that really narrow, superficial understanding of self-worth as reflected on a report card.
Thank you very much. These narratives are important. No matter if you're the first person, that's not to be looked upon lightly. So your example in sharing light, we're looking at our own wellness and well-being, the need for EQ from students. And we also hear talking about how EQ is playing a role in people's analysis of our society and in the systems of oppression. And since we've kind of hit on this theme, and given the fact that we are still dealing with a global pandemic, there have been calls for to close the global gender gap in pay. There are calls for racial justice and more anti-Blackness knowledge and understanding across the globe. And given this time that we're in and thinking about the critical decisions and junctures we are at, how can colleges and universities center equity in their approaches to emotional intelligence, and why you think that would be beneficial? And since we haven't had our Rochonda and Robert, we'll start there and then go to the students in reverse order, if that'd be okay. So Rochonda or Robert?
Robert, do you want to go?
I could go. Thank you, Rochonda.
Okay.
I think this is one of the central potential contributions that we have for social emotional learning is in the area of equity. I mean, going way back to the foundings of some of the early theory around social motives from David McClelland, he wrote a very famous article called "Testing for Competence versus Intelligence." I mean, this goes back to the very founding of social emotional intelligence as a potentially, because it has to be implemented correctly, a potentially better way to think about recruiting, developing, selecting people for either admission, jobs, promotion, because it came from a very basic observation that Dr. McClelland had, was that intelligence of the traditional kind didn't really correlate very well with leadership effectiveness, right? So he just asked the very basic question: if traditional notions of intelligence don't account for very much of the variance in leadership performance or job performance across a lot of roles, what does? Okay. And that's where we find, I think, the true power. And since not so much in my work with universities, but in my own consulting practice around selection, you find that when these competency-based assessment protocols are implemented well, you do tend to see, not always, but you tend to see more equity in hiring and promotions. When you focus on the things that actually matter versus what we're told matters, which doesn't matter as much as you've been told. Right? So that's not to say intelligence is important, okay? But it really is social emotional skills, that can really help you unleash that technical and cognitive knowledge. And that's the most important point. And I think when it's done well, I mean, this really can be a way to promote diversity, equity, inclusion in all kinds of organizations.
Thank you, Robert. Rochonda.
So I think it's from a higher ed perspective. I look at this from really being the intentionality of what we include in our curriculum. I think specifically it's about modeling it, but being intentional about our instruction of it. So for EQ, I think it's very much operationalizing that. So if you understand the importance of EQ, how are you designing your classroom? I think about during the pandemic and during COVID and all these things, and even, in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all these things that have been coming up, CRT, how do you help people navigate to have the conversations that need to be had? So one of the things I tend to do is always kind of reference a book. So I want to reference Singleton's book about courageous conversations, because that gives you a good model to use. And I've been using these things intentionally with my students. But in particular, I think there should be a focus on how we allow students to understand that we have care and compassion for them, because the same thing we want them to demonstrate for others, then we've got to model it. So when a student comes to me and says, "Hey, I need a mental health day," or I am trying to figure out what life decisions are, that is not me saying the assignment is still due on Thursday, right? That's me saying that I understand this. I'm like, I don't have an educational emergency that if the paper doesn't come in on Friday, like the world falls apart. That doesn't exist in education. Although people like to act like it does, it really doesn't. So I have to demonstrate the ability to still maintain my rigor and expectations, but give people grace. I tell the students all this time, all this semester, we're going to work with each other, we're going to learn a lot, but we're also going to give each other grace because that's what we do in the real world. So I want to model that for my students, and I hope that they will do that for their future students. The other thing that I think is really important in terms of higher education, when you mention in particular about this current context that we're living in, is that we have to decenter like whiteness and supremacy in the scope of things and allow for other intellectual traditions, which I know that sounds weird when we're talking about SEL, but what happens is when we allow other intellectual traditions in from an Asian, from an indigenous perspective, from a Chicano, Latinx perspective, from an African perspective, what you do is that you say that everybody's perspective or understanding or ways of knowing and gathering knowledge and ways of being is acceptable. And once you do that, that helps with equity because it means that everybody has the opportunity to influence what's happening, right? And so I think about that in terms of what I intentionally put in my curriculum. Who am I introducing my students to in terms of who are the scholars in this field rather than the usual suspects? Like if I hear Vygotsky one more time, not that Vygotsky isn't a bad guy, but there are other people who have influenced work that come from other intellectual traditions. And so if we really want to bring equity in, we actually have to demonstrate that to our students and that it's a more inclusivity, right? And talk about collectivism rather than being independent. We talk about stories and counter narratives. All these things help create more equitable spaces. You can't just have this wonderful mission statement that says equity and inclusion, and yet you don't have the feminist perspective and you don't have the LGBTQ perspective. That's not equity. It's a great tagline, but it's not really equity when you operationalize it. So my thing to people is always, okay, that was really pretty. What does that look like when it's operationalized? And so that's the thing that I'm looking for, that I think higher education has to be held to that standard. Okay, soapbox is dismounted.
Oh, no. We'll give you a score. I'm sure it's a 10 for your dismount. This was, I think your answers, Rochonda, as you were commenting, I was thinking so much about what you were saying in terms of knowledge and additional looking at different learning systems and different places where knowledge comes from. And I think one of the things we also have an opportunity to in the EQ world is look at alternative origin stories for EQ. There have been many traditions throughout many cultures that have many of the tenets that we talk about in EQ in terms of compassion and awareness and empathy for others and sharing and altruism. Those things didn't just come into place and being when Daniel Goleman, wrote a book. There have been many knowledge traditions that existed way before that have already incorporated that knowledge. So many times we can go back in our own histories and also find emotional intelligence elements because it didn't necessarily start at this particular juncture. And your point about us incorporating other systems of knowledge into our curriculum in higher education is well said, well taken. For the students, what are your thoughts about what should higher education do in terms of given these inequities throughout our society? How should higher education approach EQ and equity in the curriculum or co-curricular? Go, Rachel. I'm going to pick somebody.
Yeah, basically what you just said is kind of what I wrote my thesis on. So I'm like, yep, there it is. Like I just talked about like Western epistemology and how our knowledge system in itself is kind of a system of oppression, just the way we're taught to relate to each other and all that. But like that really made me think about something I wrote about is how we talk a lot about SEL in the classroom and it gets packaged in a very specific way. But like all those tenets didn't start when it started being called SEL. I think a lot of like indigenous knowledges and like grounded normativity, like all of that was centered around it. And it's just like been here for so long. And I think that it can be harmful when we start valuing SEL in the classroom, but only because like it's being packaged as SEL, not these long traditions of resistance that have been here forever. And I think when I think about like SEL in the classroom, I think a lot of times the way it gets taught to us, there's this emphasis on what's the word, like regulation and being able to control your emotions, which I think isn't necessarily the best, I think, approach. I think a lot about like Audre Lorde and the uses of anger, and I think like that piece just like, I think is everything that needs to be said, to be honest. But just like that sitting still and just responding to a question, I think I don't think there's equity in higher education when that happens, because it's assuming that everyone has no connection to whatever is being talked about. And I think it says, okay, you can't get angry about what is being talked about in the classroom. But I think if you're not getting angry, then either you're not understanding, or you're not talking about what needs to be talked about, because our systems, everything about it is just so deeply ingrained in racism and settler colonialism and capitalism and all this. So if we're not holding space for genuine anger and reaction in the classroom, then I don't think we're having the conversations we need to have. So I think, really emphasizing that we can't just see classrooms as a place of just like, I don't know, just very calm, very just like chill conversation. Like we need spaces for passion. And I think also, a lot about kind of what Rochonda was saying, like you have professors talk about SEL and equity, and then if you ask for an extension, they'll be like, no. So I think like actually matching like what you're saying is such a big one. Like I've had friends who have taken political science classes and have professors want to spend an entire semester talking about like racial equity, and then when they go to the professor saying like they're having a problem, they need more time, they're like, sucks for you, like figure it out. And I just feel like that's the epitome of academia, is like, okay, we want to have these conversations about like racial justice or any other pushing against a system of oppression, but it stays as a conversation. And as soon as it's time to treat people like human beings, they're like, that's too far for us. We can't go that far and, have empathy for you. Like that's too much. So I think really taking these conversations from conversations into action and really recognizing the harm that happens to students in the classroom when you have conversations to pretend like it's not anyone's lived experience is a big one. And also just like, like having grace. I feel like we just need so much more of that in the classroom.
Thank you.
I just want to, I'm sorry, Isaac.
No, go ahead. Oh, yeah.
It just made me think about, Rachel, what you said. I have a really good friend who's currently in Ukraine, and she's a professor in the Ukraine. And she is still there. Her students are still Zooming in and having their class, even in the midst of all this. And I did a session with them on social emotional learning, which is not even a topic that is it's not really big in Ukraine, in some parts of Europe. And it made me think of what you said is very similar to what some of their students said. When I mentioned what SEL is and how we should be kind of doing that in higher ed to support students and nurture them, and they're like almost in tears saying, yes, I am struggling as a student, like in the midst of war, and literally in the midst of war, and professors are still not understanding that they don't have like Wi-Fi access sometimes, and saying like you can't miss class in the middle of war. So it's like, how do we help people if you're going to espouse these things? How do you use it in a way that lets your students know that you are there for them, and it's just not some theoretical concept, right? It's not just a construct, but it's something that can be done and lived out. So I definitely appreciate you saying that. I feel that so much for our students. We have high expectations, and there's nothing wrong with that. But part of education is to be compassionate. Like we're not in a factory, like we don't punch out widgets. Like we work with like live human beings, but we tend to forget that when we look at standards and objectives.
Thank you, Rochonda. Did any one of you, Deborah or Noah, want to share your thoughts on what higher education can do to better support equity?
Yeah, I was hoping to quickly touch on this. And I see a question. I see a question in the chat, which is kind of like what I'm going to get at, which is how do you encourage students to express their emotions in the classroom? Because I think part of what educators in like the college and university setting need to consider is that as it stands, there are currently a lot of barriers enabling students to express their emotions in the classroom. And I think that part of that stems from the fact that college education from the student perspective can feel very authoritarian. Oftentimes it feels as though if we do express our emotions, if we do express our feelings, that they won't be heard, that we're kind of speaking into a void, and that there's not that receptiveness on the other end. And so when it comes down to considering equity and what colleges and universities can do, how they can center equity, I really just advocate for like a student-centered approach where, faculty members and administrators just listen and be receptive to student feedback, and really be available. And I think that availability in the college setting, oftentimes like we think of things like office hours, but even office hours, I think, prevent a tremendous barrier for people, especially students of color, who are oftentimes feeling like they're pushed into I don't love this phrase, but like an old boys club, is what I've often heard expressed by many of my peers, that's the feeling that they get when they go into office hours. And office hours, even then, a lot of professors won't really invite emotions into that space. Oftentimes that's a purely academic, that's a purely that's a purely intellectual space, where somehow intellectual conversations and emotions need to be separated from one another. So I totally agree with everyone in terms of giving grace. And I also think that has a lot to do with just listening to students and being willing to kind of factor student needs into the conversations around, how we can move forward with our approach to a college education.
Thank you, Anoa. Deborah, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I can quickly add. I think I just want to echo what everyone said, like so powerful already. And I think just to really drill it in, like honestly, like as a student, it sucks when everyone around you is completely blind to what's happening. It sucks when you hear people advocate for this and that, and then when it comes down to actually talking to you, completely gone. It's a lot of this justice work and a lot of this like emotional, like emotional intelligence is performative. A lot of it like doesn't actually like do anything. It's just to look good. And sadly, like a lot of the people that are at college like have money, are white, like have had these privileges that like whether they like it or not, like they don't understand what it's like to actually go through some of these struggles. And it's exhausting. Like we have to decenter this whiteness. We have to like elevate these voices. And the only way to do it is like being vulnerable with one another. And it's uncomfortable. And a lot of people aren't going to like it, but we have to do it. I think to echo even further, like when I think the moments that stick out to me the most in school aren't like, oh, I did well on this test, I did well on this grade, whatever. It's when teachers were like very real with me and very vulnerable with me and actually like talked about what was going on in the world. And I don't mean like taking a political side, like, oh, this, that, like it's like the world sucks right now. This is going on right now. Like I see what you guys are doing as not only students, but as human beings. And like, my heart goes out for you. Like it's after the former presidential election, like at school, just from my community, like a predominantly like POC community, just like how all of us were just in tears and like scared, like for our parents being deported, like all these feelings, and like how the teachers were there for us to console us, like, and were honest with us. Like that's what we need more of. I think there's more damage done if you don't acknowledge the things that are going on than good. So I just hope that more teachers can be vulnerable and straight up with us and not be scared to make mistakes, because mistakes will be made. But that's growing and it's painful, but it's needed.
Thank you very much. We're about at time for this opening plenary. There are some workshops and roundtables for us to explore later on. Before we leave, I want to share with you a slide we are doing some research as part of this process. And I wanted to share with you that right now, in terms of our early respondents, 100% of administrators and faculty think that EQ is important, but only 15% says it's a priority on their campus. And then the other additional slide is talking about the mindsets, attitudes, and dispositions that we hopefully are in our educational experience for students. 94% said that it's important, but only 30% say it's happening on my campus. So as we think about the students, what they've shared, what our colleagues, professionals have shared, the high need and the application for EQ is present, and the evidence is overwhelming in terms of how it can help influence ourselves and our society. That's the challenge for us, and part of why we're having this conference over these 3 days, and we'll continue with some work throughout the year. We want to be able to bring and highlight more opportunities for faculty, staff, administration, students, groundskeepers, cafeteria workers, security guards, on the whole campus community can get the benefit of what higher education can provide, not just the job or the accolades, but what it really takes to live in a global society, to be an engaged citizen and be a person and a traveler and scholar of the world, so that we can understand each other and be able to solve these complex problems and challenges that we have. And without EQ, it's going to be impossible, from my opinion, impossible to do it. But the promise is right here on the screen with these young people and these dedicated professionals who are giving their time and energy to what we are learning today. So I want to thank all of you. A round of applause or a round of chat applause to everyone on the panel. You did a wonderful job. You shared some very important information. I feel I have learned something for my next time I'm in front of young people when I'm teaching my courses to further develop and incorporate this. And I'm hoping you out there who have viewed this have taken something away, and that you're going to share it with someone in your life and your campus soon. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and thank you all for attending this opening plenary.
I agree. I was taking notes madly and tweeting and thinking, and I felt inspired and uplifted and encouraged and challenged. And as a white man who didn't realize that I was a white man until a few years ago, this intersection of equity and emotional intelligence is an area that has been incredibly powerful for me. And I see that this is a place where the rubber really meets the road on how we use our emotions for collective liberation. And do we move out of this space of like me, and actually feel the connection? And I appreciate that theme coming up today. And I'm so grateful to Deborah, Donna Keegan, and Isaac and Amal and the other members of the organizing committee for this conference to decide to bring student voices into the first session. And thank you, students and former students for being here. And I want to reiterate what Dr. Carter said, that there are a whole variety of workshops now coming up for the rest of the day. Some of the students / former students are going to be in some of those workshops, I believe. I saw some of your faces on there. Dr. Carter's got some more, and those sessions are going to be Zoom meeting style, so you'll be able to have breakout rooms and discussions and interaction. And then tomorrow, same time, same place, we have our next panel, which will also be live streamed. So those of you who are watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. Thanks everybody for being here. And we're at 6 seconds. Our commitment is to grow emotional intelligence in the world. And we want to collaborate to do that with everyone, everywhere. We believe that these are the skills that the world needs, and that the only way we're going to get 1 billion people practicing emotional intelligence is if we do it in a collective way. So thank you all for participating and watching and engaging. Wonderful comments in the chat. And we will be sharing this with the other 700 people who signed up for the conference. And I look forward to seeing folks in the next sessions.
Yes, thank you all. See you all tomorrow.